Clara had built her life to scale. Everything on the farm obeyed that quiet rule. Low fences, narrow gates, barns that felt more like shelters and structures. The animals reflected it too. Miniature horses no taller than her shoulder, goats that fit under her arm. Creatures whose smallness made the world feel manageable again. That morning, as mist thinned across the pasture, the rule shattered. The draft horse stood at the center of it all, immense and still, like a misplaced monument. He did not paw the ground or test the fence. He simply stood there, broad chest rising slowly, breath fogging the air. His coat was the color of wet earth, dark and patient, marked by old scars that crossed muscle like pale memories. Clara stayed several yards away, aware of the absurdity of distance when faced with that much animal. One careless step from him could undo years of careful building. One careless choice from her already had. She told herself she was only keeping him for the day, that the truck would return, that mistakes corrected themselves if he waited long enough. But as the minutes stretched, the reality pressed in. The paperwork was signed, the sun was climbing, and the horse was here. He shifted his weight, the ground responding with a dull, reverent thud, and Clara felt it travel up through her boots into her bones. She fetched hay meant for animals half his size, laying it out with a cautious arm, every movement deliberate. The horse lowered his head slowly, as if measuring her intent, then began to eat with surprising delicacy. Each bite was careful, almost restrained. Clara watched his mouth, the way he avoided spilling, the way his ears flicked toward her footsteps rather than away. Something in her chest loosened, just a fraction. Still, fear clung to her. She imagined fences splintering, miniature hooves crushed under misplaced weight, the phone calls she would have to make explaining how she had let something so big into something so fragile. Responsibility pressed in from all sides. This farm was her last attempt at usefulness after loss, her proof that care could still exist without catastrophe. The horse finished eating and did not move off. He lifted his head and looked at her directly. His eyes were not wild or confused, but observant, dark pools holding a quiet question. Clara resisted the urge to step back. Instead, she stayed where she was, letting the space between them speak. Wind stirred the grass, carrying the scent of hay and damp soil, and for a moment the world felt narrow to that shared breath. She brought out a brush, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Her hand trembled as she approached. The horse tensed when the bristles touched his leg, muscles tightening like coiled rope, and Clara stopped instantly. She waited. Seconds passed. Then he released a long breath, the sound low and vibrating, and the tension eased. She resumed, slower now, brushing mud and old straw from his coat. Dust rose around them, catching the light, and with each stroke she felt something settle into place. She worked her way along his massive frame, discovering the geography of him, the strength in his shoulders, the softness behind his knees, the faint heat where old harness marks had healed poorly. This body had labored. It had carried weight without complaint. Clara recognized that kind of endurance. She had lived it in smaller ways. As the morning wore on, the miniature animals gathered at a cautious distance. A tiny pony crept closer, curiosity outweighing fear, and settled near the horse's shadow. He did not react. He stood like an anchored thing, adjusting his stance so his bulk blocked the wind from the smaller body. Clara noticed a gesture and felt something shift. It was instinct, not training. Protection without drama. She named him then, quietly, the word forming before she had time to stop it. Atlas, not because of his strength, but because of the invisible weight he seemed to carry. The name felt right as soon as it left her mouth. He flicked an ear, acknowledging the sound without turning, and the simplicity of that response filled her with unexpected relief. The central problem did not disappear with the naming. If anything, it sharpened. Atlas could not stay as things were. The farm was not built for him. Keeping him meant change, structural, financial, emotional. Letting him go meant undoing the fragile trust forming between them. Clara leaned against the fence, watching him stand among the small lives he dwarfed, and felt the familiar pull between safety and meaning. Clouds rolled in by afternoon, flattening the light. Clara rigged temporary reinforcements, hammering boards with focus that bordered on desperation. Atlas followed her movements with calm attention, stepping where she guided, stopping when she stopped. Once, as she slipped on wet grass, he shifted his body subtly, creating space, preventing her fall. She froze, heart racing, aware how closely disaster and grace now lived together. As dusk approached, Clara stood alone at the pasture gate. Atlas approached without prompting, stopping just short of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She rested her palm against his shoulder, the muscle firm and alive beneath her touch. He leaned into it, barely, a trust offered without ceremony. The sky darkened, and the farm grew quiet. In that stillness, Clara understood the truth she had been circling all day. This was not about scale, or fences, or mistakes. It was about whether she would allow something larger than her fear to take root. Atlas lowered his head, breath steady against her sleeve, and the decision settled into her bones, irreversible and thrilling. Clara woke before dawn with the sensation that the land itself was listening. The farm lay hushed beneath a low sky, the kind that pressed close and made every sound feel important. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside, breath catching when she saw Atlas already awake, standing near the pasture fence as if he had been waiting. He turned his head at her approach, slow and deliberate, and something in that measured movement steadied her racing thoughts. The day demanded choices she had been avoiding. Keeping Atlas meant reinforcing fences, rerouting paths, changing routines that had once felt sacred. It meant admitting that her careful balance was no longer enough. As she crossed the grass, damp with night, she felt the old resistance rise. She had built this place to be predictable. Healing, she believed, required limits. Atlas tested that belief with every quiet step. She brought him water in a trough meant for cattle long gone. He drank without splashing, lips barely disturbing the surface, and she noticed how often his eyes returned to her face. Not seeking instruction, but connection. Clara brushed him again, slower this time, her strokes confident enough to communicate intent. His body responded with subtle shifts, leaning where she needed him to lean, yielding space when she stepped close. It felt less like training and more like negotiation. By mid-morning, the first visitor arrived. Mrs. Holloway from down the road stood at the gate, hands folded tightly around her purse, gaze fixed on Atlas with a mixture of awe and concern. Clara saw herself reflected there, the instinct to protect what was small battling the pull of something extraordinary. She offered no explanation, only opened the gate and let the woman watch. Atlas stood still, lowering his head as if aware of being seen, his presence calming rather than threatening. Word traveled the way it always did in quiet places. By afternoon, 2 children pressed their faces against the fence rails, whispering questions they were too shy to ask aloud. Clara hovered nearby, ready to intervene, but Atlas surprised her again. He stepped back, creating space, then knelt slightly at the knees, lowering himself to their eye level. The children froze, then laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. Clara felt tears sting, not from fear this time, but from relief. Still, resistance surfaced when the day wore on. Atlas startled at the slam of a barn door, muscles bunching, breath quickening. Clara moved without thinking, placing herself between him and the sound, her hand raised, palm open. She spoke softly, not words so much as tone, letting calm shape the air. He stilled, eyes on her, and the moment passed. The realization struck her hard. He trusted her to interpret the world for him. The weight of that trust settled heavily. As evening approached, Clara checked the perimeter again, noting where boards would need replacing, where gates would have to be widened. The work felt daunting, yet beneath it ran a current of resolve she had not felt in years. Atlas followed her, step for step, his shadow stretching long across the grass. When she stopped, he stopped. When she sighed, he lowered his head, mirroring the gesture. The bond was forming not through grand acts, but through repetition and presence. The true test came at sunset. A sudden crack of thunder rolled across the sky, close and violent. Miniature animals scattered, panic rippling through the pasture. Atlas reared slightly, massive body poised on the edge of flight. Clara's heart hammered. One wrong move could unravel everything. She ran to him, fear sharp and electric, and pressed her forehead against his chest, grounding herself first. Her breathing slowed. Gradually, his followed. Rain fell hard, drenching them both. Clara stood there, soaked and shaking, holding space until the storm passed. Atlas lowered himself fully, kneeling in the mud, choosing stillness over strength. The image burned itself into her memory, the largest being on her farm, making himself smaller, so the world could feel safer. When the rain eased, Clara sank to the ground beside him, exhaustion washing over her. Atlas remained where he was, close enough that she could feel the steady rhythm of his heart through the earth. In that shared quiet, something in her finally gave way. The conflict she had been resisting resolved itself not into certainty, but into commitment. She could not promise ease. She could promise effort. She stayed there until night fully claimed the sky. When she rose, Atlas rose with her, careful not to crowd her, matching her pace back toward the barn. At the door, she paused, turned to look at him one last time before closing it against the dark. He met her gaze, calm and unwavering, a presence that felt less like an intrusion and more like an answer. Inside, Clara leaned against the door, heart full and aching all at once. The farm would change. She would change. The fear was still there, but it no longer led. Outside, Atlas settled into the pasture, the sound of his breath carrying softly through the night. Clara smiled despite herself, knowing with a quiet thrill that whatever came next, it would not be small. Morning arrived, softened by rain. The farm smelled newly made, earth dark and rich, the grass pressed flat where Atlas had knelt the night before. Clara stepped outside with a mug warming her hands and found him already standing, water beating along his coat, mane heavy and dripping. He turned when he sensed her, not startled, not expectant, simply aware. It felt like being noticed in a way that carried no demand. The miniature animals emerged cautiously, shaking damp from their coats. One by one they drifted toward Atlas, curiosity overcoming memory. A goat brushed past his leg. A small donkey lingered beneath his neck, using his body as shelter from the lingering drizzle. Atlas adjusted himself with deliberate care, widening his stance, redistributing his weight, so none of them were crowded. Clara watched, struck by the precision of his gentleness. Strength, she realized, could be fluent. She spent the morning repairing what the storm had tested. Boards were reset, latches tightened, plans rewritten in her head. Atlas stayed near but never underfoot, a steady presence that seemed to anticipate her needs. When she struggled to lift a heavy gate panel, he leaned into it instinctively, the wood rising with ease. She laughed then, surprised by the sound of it, surprised that it still lived inside her. Visitors arrived without announcement, as if drawn by something unspoken. A man from a neighboring valley stood silently at the fence, hat in hand, eyes fixed on Atlas. Clara recognized the look, someone carrying weight they no longer knew how to set down. She did not invite him in. She did not need to. Atlas took a step closer to the fence and stood there, breathing slow and even. The man exhaled, shoulders sagging, and left without a word. Clara understood that something had passed between them regardless. By afternoon, children returned braver now. They sat cross-legged in the grass, tracing patterns in the dirt, while Atlas watched over them like a quiet landmark. One child reached out and rested a forehead against his leg, small body trembling with something unnameable. Atlas did not flinch. He lowered his head until his muzzle brushed the child's hair, a gesture so careful it bordered on reverent. Clara felt the moment lodge itself deep inside her. Yet the questions would not leave her alone. How long could this last? What would happen when the cost rose, when the novelty faded, when reality pressed back? She had lived long enough to know that miracles demanded maintenance. That evening, as the light thinned and the day exhaled, she sat on the fence rail and let the doubts surface fully. Atlas approached, stopping just close enough that she could rest her hand against his shoulder without effort. The heat of him grounded her. She spoke aloud then, not to him exactly, but not away from him either. She named her fears, her limits, her reluctance to hope too much. Atlas listened in the way animals do, without interruption, without solution. When she finished, he shifted his weight and leaned gently into her touch, enough to remind her she was not alone in the question. The shift came quietly. A boy arrived just before sunset, led by his grandmother. He was older than the others, his movement stiff, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. Clara felt the instinctive tightening in her chest, the fear of responsibility misjudged. She started to speak, to set boundaries, but Atlas moved first. He lowered himself slowly, deliberately, until he knelt in the grass, massive body folded with intention. The boy stopped. His attention snapped into focus, drawn by the impossible sight. He took a step forward, then another. When he reached Atlas, he placed both hands on the horse's face, fingers sinking into warm hair. His breath hitched. Atlas stayed utterly still, eyes half-lidded, presence unwavering. Time seemed to hold its breath with him. The boy stopped. His attention snapped into focus, drawn by the impossible sight. He took a step forward, then another. When he reached Atlas, he placed both hands on the horse's face, fingers sinking into warm hair. His breath hitched. Atlas stayed utterly still, eyes half-lidded, presence unwavering. Time seemed to hold its breath with them. The boy laughed then, a sharp, surprised sound that cracked something open. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against Atlas's, and for a long moment neither moved. Clara felt tears spill freely, unashamed. She understood in that instant that this was no longer about whether Atlas fit the farm. It was about whether she was willing to let the farm become what it clearly wanted to be. When the boy finally stepped back, his posture had changed. He stood taller, steadier, as if he had found a reference point inside himself. His grandmother pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes shining. She did not thank Clara. She did not need to. The gratitude was already spoken. Night settled gently, stars emerging one by one. Clara closed the gates later than usual, her body tired in a way that felt earned. Atlas followed her to the edge of the pasture and stopped, watching as she turned toward the house. She paused, looking back at him silhouetted against the dark, immense and calm and utterly present. For the first time since the farm began, Clara did not feel like its keeper alone. She felt like its witness. The path ahead remained uncertain, demanding, larger than anything she had planned. But standing there, with Atlas breathing steadily in the night air, she felt the unmistakable pull of purpose. Whatever this was becoming, she knew she would follow it, even if it asked to grow far beyond the life she had built to stay small. The change announced itself in subtle ways before it ever became visible. Clara noticed in the mornings first, in how the farm no longer felt like something she managed alone. There was a quiet expectancy in the air now, a sense that the land itself was waiting for something to unfold. Atlas stood at the center of it, not commanding attention, but anchoring it, his presence steady as a horizon. People began arriving without appointment or explanation. They parked along the dirt road and walked the last stretch in silence, as if instinct told them to approach gently. Clara watched from a distance at first, uncertain how to hold this growing current. She had never invited crowds. This place had been built for containment, for healing that stayed small and safe. Yet Atlas met each newcomer with the same calm acknowledgement, lowering his head slightly, breathing slow, offering himself without condition. A retired soldier came one afternoon, his posture rigid, eyes scanning for threats that no longer lived here. He stood at the fence for a long time, hands gripping the wire until his knuckles whitened. Atlas approached and stopped just short of him, close enough that their breaths shared the same rhythm. The man's shoulders sagged and shook. He sank to his knees in the grass, forehead pressed against Atlas's leg, and stayed there until the tension drained from his body. Clara did not interrupt. She learned that day that witnessing could be an act of care. Children came next, some loud with curiosity, others quiet with fear. Atlas adjusted each of them, bending his massive neck, so they did not have to reach, stepping back when they needed space, stepping closer when they faltered. A little girl with trembling hands braided flowers into his mane, her fingers gaining confidence with each loop. Her mother watched, tears tracing slow paths down her cheeks, and Clara felt the unmistakable weight of responsibility settle deeper into her chest. The miniature animals changed too. They no longer scattered at the sound of unfamiliar voices. They lingered, sensing safety in Atlas's shadow. A tiny horse slept pressed against his flank. Goats climbed the low fence and perched nearby, as if the giant had redefined the boundaries of their world. Clara saw in their ease a reflection of her own growing trust. Still, doubt followed her like a second shadow. She worried about costs, about sustainability, about the inevitable moment when something would go wrong. Late one evening, she walked the pasture alone, counting steps, measuring distances, calculating risks. Atlas followed at a respectful distance, his hooves barely disturbing the ground. When she stopped, he stopped. When she turned, he turned. The synchronicity unsettled her, not because it felt unnatural, but because it felt intentional. She finally sank onto a weathered fence post, exhaustion catching up with her. Atlas approached and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder, surprised by how easily the gesture came. In that moment, she understood that this was no longer about managing a miracle. It was about trusting one. The realization arrived without drama but carried undeniable force. Atlas had not simply joined her farm. He had widened it, not in acreage, but in purpose. What had begun as a refuge for the small and fragile was becoming a place where pain of all sizes could be held. The idea terrified her. It also felt unmistakably right. As night settled in, the last visitors drifted away, quieter than when they had arrived. The stars emerged, sharp and clear, and the farm breathed out. Clara stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Atlas move among the animals with patient care, his massive form softened by moonlight. She felt a tremor of "or" run through her, followed by something steadier and stronger. This was bigger than her grief, bigger than her fear, bigger even than Atlas's immense frame. It was a calling she had not asked for, but could no longer ignore. Clara placed her hand over her heart, feeling it beat with renewed purpose. Tomorrow would bring questions, challenges, and change she could not yet imagine. But tonight, standing in the quiet with a gentle giant and a community beginning to gather around him, she knew with absolute clarity that her life had shifted course, and there would be no turning back. Time did not rush after that. It unfolded. The farm learned a new rhythm, and Clara learned to move with it instead of ahead of it. Mornings no longer felt like obligations stacked one atop another, but invitations, quiet chances to witness what had taken root. Atlas remained the constant center, his presence steady enough that the rest of the world seemed to reorganize itself around him. Clara began making changes she once would have postponed indefinitely. Gates were widened, paths rerouted. Old storage sheds were cleared and opened into light. Each adjustment felt less like a concession and more like an admission of truth. This place was no longer defined by what excluded. It was being shaped by what it could hold. People came more often now, not in crowds, but in careful intervals, as if drawn by instinct rather than curiosity. A veteran arrived one afternoon, shoulders locked tight, eyes scanning exits. He stood at the fence for a long time before stepping inside. Atlas noticed him immediately. He did not approach. He simply positioned himself between a man and the open pasture, a solid, immovable presence that seemed to say, "Nothing here will rush you." The man sat on the ground eventually, back against the fence, breathing slowing by degrees. When he left hours later, his steps were quieter. Clara watched these moments with a growing sense of humility. She had not orchestrated them. She had only made space. Atlas did the rest, offering a stillness like a language everyone somehow understood. Children spoke less loudly around him. Adults touched him with reverence. Even those who never laid a hand on his coat seemed altered just by standing near. The weight of responsibility returned in subtler forms. There were bills now, permits to consider, conversations she could no longer avoid. Some nights Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was equal to what this place was becoming. The old fear whispered that she would fail, that she would disappoint the trust forming around her. On those nights, she would step outside and find Atlas awake, standing beneath the stars, breath slow and even. Being near him did not erase her doubt, but reminded her she did not need to resolve everything at once. The shift toward legacy came quietly, almost accidentally. A local therapist asked if she could bring a small group regularly. A school counselor followed. Clara hesitated, feeling the old instinct to protect what was fragile. But when she looked at Atlas, calm amid the activity, she understood fragility was no longer the point. What mattered was continuity. Showing up again and again, the climactic moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon, disguised by simplicity. A boy came with his mother, his body rigid, his gaze distant. He did not speak. Clara had learned not to push. Atlas approached slowly, then stopped several feet away, lowering himself until he was eye level. The boy watched him, breath shallow, fingers clenched. Minutes passed. The farm seemed quiet around them. Atlas extended his neck just slightly, an offering without insistence. The boy reached out, hesitated, then placed his palm against Atlas's cheek. His hand trembled. Atlas closed his eyes. A sound emerged, soft, broken, unmistakably a word. The mother collapsed to her knees. Clara felt the moment strike her like lightning, not loud, but absolute. She understood then, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that this was the work now. Not rescue, not control. Presence. Later, as the sun lowered and the visitors drifted away, Clara stood alone with Atlas in the pasture. The day's meaning settled slowly, like dust after a long journey. She rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the deep, steady rhythm beneath. In that stillness, she felt grief transform, not vanish, but reassign itself. Pain became fuel. Loss became direction. The farm no longer felt small. It felt intentional. And Clara, standing beside the horse who had arrived by mistake and stayed by purpose, knew that whatever this place would become, it would be built not on fear of breaking, but on faith in holding. If this story warmed something in your heart, take a quiet second to like this video and subscribe. These stories only live on because people like you choose to stay. The farm had grown in ways Clara had never imagined. The morning light fell softly across widened pastures and freshly painted barns, revealing a place that seemed almost alive, vibrated with the quiet joy of hundreds of small, thriving lives. Atlas stood at the center, massive and steady, the early sun catching the sheen of his coat. The miniature horses and goats move around him with calm familiarity, their tiny bodies brushing against his shadow, as if the world had somehow stretched to make space for him. Clara watched from the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and felt the same awe she had felt the first morning he arrived. Only now it was deeper, softer, laced with purpose. The ripple effect had spread far beyond the farm's boundaries. Visitors came from distant towns, children with anxiety, veterans seeking calm, parents searching for a quiet miracle. They came timidly at first, unsure what to expect from a farm that had begun as a sanctuary for the miniature. But Atlas welcomed them without expectation, without demand. He became a bridge, a living symbol of patience and gentle guidance. Clara had tried to warn herself not to hope too much, but every soft nicker, every measured step, every pause that let someone feel safe without words reminded her that miracles often arrive in silence. She remembered the day the autistic boy had spoken his first word, the day a veteran had leaned back against the fence, finally exhaling, the day children had run their hands along Atlas's massive legs and laughed without fear. That day had not been the start. It had been a threshold. Now, the farm existed beyond individual moments. It was a network of lives quietly shifting, reshaping. Even Clara herself felt it. Grief had been tempered into resilience. Fear softened into attention, and loneliness gave way to belonging. The morning brought a new rhythm. Clara walked slowly through the fields, Atlas followed at her side, ears swiveling to the sounds of miniature hooves and bird calls. The wind carried the faint scent of fresh hay and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance a crow's call punctuated the vast quiet. She knelt to check a small fence post, Atlas resting one shoulder lightly near her, the weight of him almost grounding, almost protective. His presence was a constant reminder that the farm no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to all who sought refuge, to all who needed a moment of steadiness in a chaotic world. Later, a small group of children approached, led by a teacher from a nearby town. They moved cautiously, glances flicking toward Atlas, whispers riding the morning air. Clara held her breath, but the moment passed as he lowered his enormous head, brushing the tallest child's hair with his nose in a gesture of quiet reassurance. Laughter bubbled, light and unconstrained, and the tension she had carried dissolved like mist under the sun. She realized that Atlas's patience, his willingness to exist gently in a space built for fragile, was teaching something far larger than herself. Healing was not in the grand gestures, but in presence, repetition, and trust. By noon, the farm had settled into its usual cadence. Atlas lay in a shaded patch of grass. The smaller animals clustered nearby, as if drawn magnetically. Clara wandered between them, touching soft coats, adjusting a water bucket, making notes in her journal. The world had grown wider, richer, because she had allowed something impossible to remain. The farm had expanded, not in acreage alone, but in depth, in possibility. She had learned that even a mistake could be a gift. Even a burden could teach balance. Atlas was living proof. The afternoon brought a quiet moment she had anticipated, but still marveled at. She walked to the fence overlooking the far pasture, where the sun glinted gold across newly sown grass. Atlas followed, stepping with deliberate grace, the earth vibrating beneath his weight. She rested a hand on his massive neck, feeling muscle and warmth and breath, and whispered her gratitude. No words existed for what this day had given, the countless invisible threads of change that had woven themselves through the lives of every creature here. Atlas stood still, and in that stillness, she found a mirror of her own heart. Large, capable, steady, and infinitely patient. Evening fell soft and expansive, painting the sky in pinks and deep purples. Clara set out lanterns along the paths for safety, their gentle glow reflecting on the windows of the barns. She paused to watch Atlas standing near the miniature horses, a silent guardian in the twilight. Tiny goats nestled at his feet. The ponies leaned against him for shade, and somewhere behind her, a bird settled into a tree to observe. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of awe. Life had moved quietly around her, reshaping itself into something miraculous and whole. Night came with a clarity she had not known in years. Clara closed the gates of the last check, Atlas standing at her side. Stars spilled across the sky, uncountable and unwavering. The air smelled of damp grass and distant pine, and the far was alive with soft breathing, soft steps, soft heartbeat. Atlas exhaled slowly, the sound reaching Clara in her chest, and she realized she'd been holding her own breath for too long. She let it go, letting space exist for all the miracles that had already arrived and those still on their way. Before stepping inside, she lingered. Her eyes traveled across the pasture, across the animals, across the gentle giant who had arrived by mistake and stayed by purpose. Every moment, every choice, every gesture had led here. Atlas had transformed the farm. Yes, but more profoundly, he had transformed her understanding of patience, of trust, of quiet resilience. Clara whispered into the night, words meant for no one but the air itself. Thank you for finding your way here. Finally, she turned toward the house, pausing at the porch rail. Atlas remained in the pasture, massive silhouette framed by lantern glow, breathing steady and calm. Clara smiled softly, the kind of smile that carries both sorrow and triumph. She knew the work would continue. New visitors, new moments of fear, new challenges. But it no longer mattered. She had learned that even the most enormous presence, even the most unexpected arrival, could become a teacher, a guardian, a miracle. The quiet settled between them, comforting and unspoken. She touched his flank lightly before stepping inside, and the night closed around the farm like a protective blanket. Outside, Atlas stood watch, not demanding, not alerting, only being steady, gentle, immense. The moonlight outlined every curve of his massive frame. The smaller animals curled in shadows at his feet. It was a tableau of balance, of harmony, of unexpected grace. Clara moved to her bedroom window and looked out once more. The farm breathed around her, alive and infinite in its smallness and largeness at once. She whispered softly, a lesson she had only just learned fully. Sometimes the things that arrive by mistake carry the purpose we have been searching for all along. And sometimes to hold them, to trust them, is to discover capacity inside ourselves that we never knew existed. She turned from a window, the sound of Atlas's steady breath carrying across the pasture. The farm was quiet now, but alive with possibility. And in the depth of that quiet, Clara understood with complete certainty that life, like Atlas, could be larger than we ever imagined, gentle, unassuming, and utterly transformative. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry and then feel whole again. Click it now, we'll be waiting.